got the old school mics. I don't have any flow or hip hop game whatsoever, but I feel like I should. It is such a pleasure to be in this room of people who understand how critical immigrant talent is to science, tech, and engineering here. Thank you so much, Eugene and everyone at One Way for having me. I had such a long list of questions for you. I had to limit myself, so I'm going to do the uncouth thing of keeping my phone nearby for some notes. I've been writing about, I work for CNBC.com and I'm a tech reporter, a longtime tech reporter. I've been writing about and waiting for robo-taxis to become a pervasive reality here for so long. And it always feels right around the corner. Although San Francisco, we have Waymos everywhere, it seems like. I'm wondering, where does Helm fit in all this? Can you tell me a little bit about what Helm does and why you're tackling that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So Helm is essentially building an AI for physical intelligence. So that includes self-driving cars, but it also generalizes to other domains in robotics, like autonomous mining or, industrial or consumer robotics. And, the thing that we're really focusing on currently is essentially helping automakers scale from partial autonomy to full autonomy, right? So going from that kind of Tesla FSD style system to something that is actually a fully autonomous car. And the focus is on consumer cars currently.
Can I ask, how do you think of what is a self-driving car in your mind? Like in a nutshell, I mean, it should be obvious, but there's all this talk about levels this, and there's some confusion out there. How do you define a self-driving car?
Yeah, so there are indeed different levels of automation. Of course, the self-driving car that everybody wants is one where you can basically just sleep in the back seat and you don't have to worry about anything. So it's kind of like having an AI private driver or something like that, right? Or a robo-taxi. But there's a different version of autonomy that's a stepping stone to that I think is equally as important, which is essentially, you can think of it as an AI assisted driving, right? So it's still fully operating the vehicle. It's using the steering and the gas and the brake, but there has to be a human still in the driver's seat, right? And so that does give you the benefit of essentially being able to handle driver fatigue better. You can drive longer distances. It can be overall still a safer system than a human driver. But because of the, kind of liability challenges, right, there's a big safety certification challenges, you're not necessarily going to be able to sleep in the back seat from a legal perspective. But it's nevertheless going to be, a very advanced system that keeps improving. And then there's also an intermediate level where essentially you can kind of take your hands off and your eyes off, and then you get, let's say, 10 seconds of warning when, you have to take over. So there, you can actually be writing an email or something like that, right? And then you get, you'll have at least 10 seconds of warning to take over. So that does give you time back beyond just, being a value add in terms of safety.
How did you come to work on this problem? What was your aha moment?
Yeah, it was actually a while ago. So it was actually an undergrad. So I was an undergrad at UCLA, and I was part of the UCLA Computer Vision Lab. And they were working on self-driving cars, and in particular the DARPA Grand Challenges. They were participating in those, and it was kind of a very immediate, passion of mine.
I'm going to assume everyone in here is. Can I get a show of hands? People familiar with the DARPA Grand Challenge? Oh, do you want to tell a little bit about that? I guess.
Yeah, that's fair. So basically, the DARPA Grand Challenges were these competitions put on by the DoD to, kind of show what's the state of the art for self-driving, right? Or really kind of push the state of the art. And so it really was kind of like the birth of that industry in some sense. It was a fairly academic thing at the time. A lot of universities competing, but it kickstarted the industry. It's what kickstarted Waymo, and everything else. I
think Cruise too.
Yeah,
had participated.
Cruise people as well came from there. So it was a very early phase of of that trajectory, and the technology was very raw at the time. But, it really, I was, very interested in AI, broadly speaking, but in particular, self-driving cars seemed like something, very interesting to me. But, I knew that it was too early technologically, so I decided to focus instead on basically applied math and just did math for like 10 years in academia. But I knew that I would eventually start a company in self-driving cars. Like that was my goal when I was like 20. So
it's a little more personal, but what was your immigration experience and journey into this, field of academics and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so, I was, born in Siberia and, I moved to the U.S. when I was 10. I think, my parents always wanted to leave and find, a new home. And I think it was a pretty classic story of essentially, looking at America as the land of opportunity. And, we had in the 90s, it became possible for us to basically, immigrate. And, we settled here in the Bay Area. So I got to grow up in the Bay Area and kind of get exposed to a lot of things that eventually kind of led me to, the entrepreneur path.
Was there a critical moment where you started to view yourself as an entrepreneur?
That's a good question. I think that it was actually something that somebody pointed out to me early on, because I was so interested in, math and science, and I was just really, really hardworking in that direction. It was actually something that somebody pointed out to me that, hey, this is actually the right background to eventually become an entrepreneur. Because I think I always had those interests, but I never quite connected the dots. I was like a teenager or something like that.
No lemonade stands or...
I would say that in my, like I said, when I was about 20, I knew that I would eventually start a company, but I was quite focused on academics at the time. And then I guess I spent much of my 20s kind of doing a lot of like theoretical business analysis, just kind of like, here's a business idea. How would you do this? And, had a lot of like things that were kind of potential companies that I didn't quite pull the trigger on. So I was always looking for a reason to drop out. But I ended up going pretty deep into academia instead. Do
you feel like your immigrant experience, just being a tween and coming to the States and having to restart in a whole new place, has influenced the way you run your business? And by the way, like, how big is your team? Where are you based? What are the player stats?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we're based here in the Bay Area in Redwood City. The team is, a bit under 100 people currently. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, definitely hugely, my, immigrant journey has hugely impacted, how I think about entrepreneurship. And I think that it's because it can be a fairly chaotic time, right? And then you have to kind of figure out how to stabilize that and really focus on what's important to, make sure that you get through that. And I think it's a very good kind of, training regimen for starting a business. I think otherwise starting a business could look quite shocking, to a lot of people. So I definitely think that it helps, and not just with being an entrepreneur. I think that for any form of achievement, it helps. And in particular, the way I think about it is like if your family sacrificed a lot to get somewhere, you're going to take it more seriously to then, take that to the next step.
When you get together with other founders who are also immigrants or first generation here, what are you guys complaining about these days? Is it the food? I don't know about the food in Siberia.
Yeah, actually, one of my good buddies is also an immigrant founder. There's always stuff to complain about, but I think that, we mostly just kind of nerd out about AI. And, for immigrant founders, I think it's kind of like complain less and work more, kind of situation.
Ooh, nice answer. Very diplomatic. I like the attitude, although I will say I feel like complaining is a long life strategy, because the more you complain, the longer God makes you live, I have some, speaking of nerding out on AI, This totally felt like the first year for me. And I get all this wonderful access to try out like test vehicles from these companies involved in autonomous development. But it felt like the first year for me that like my normie friends who are not tech reporters or involved in the field were taking robotaxi rides. Like it's on the brink of going mainstream here. But the company that is, pretty far ahead is Google's AV unit Waymo. And it just feels like the autos industry, like the legacy autos, are struggling to catch up. And I wonder, like, what needs to happen technologically to see truly driverless systems, like you were saying, where you could just fall asleep in the back of the car. What's needed to get us there? What are some of the tech hurdles?
Yeah, absolutely. So indeed, I think for, the automakers that are trying to catch up, it's a difficult situation because, in the early days, they kind of overinvested into going directly to full autonomy, right? So there was a lot of capital going to pure L4, and that turned out to be a lot harder than they anticipated. And since then, they've understood that really where you have to focus is kind of large-scale deployment of consumer cars and making them partially autonomous. And it's also driven by the competition they're seeing from, Tesla FSD and now also, OEMs from China coming out with very advanced systems. But, because of those kind of early false starts, they basically have, they're years behind in terms of actual, software-defined fleet deployment. But ultimately they understand that, software is going to be the key differentiator for, cars in a long term. But in terms of the technology that has to happen, in my opinion, I think that basically, if you look at sort of what's been happening in AI generally, right? So like large language models have shown clearly that, scaling laws are powerful, right? So training models on a lot of data and making the models bigger can give you these emergent capabilities. But even with that, there's going to be the limits of scaling. Whereas in self-driving cars, you kind of have this big issue of this kind of like data wall, where essentially, it's very difficult to actually collect a lot of data. Tesla has millions of vehicles on the road collecting data, but many other OEMs don't have that. And so even if you were to try to apply those scaling laws, you might not have as much data. But the thing is, so I think what has to happen essentially is instead of kind of like just trying to maximizing how many miles you drive, you have to learn more from every mile that you do drive. And, kind of the basic analogy is that, like a teenager learns how to drive in a few weeks without any significant amount of driving data, right? But it's because they've already learned how to do many other things. And in particular, they can already perceive the world extremely robustly, right? They've already understood like the basics of physics and sight, right?
And a lifetime of maybe being a passenger in vehicles too, observing the traffic laws.
I think that's certainly helpful, but I would say that that's actually not the main factor. Mm-hmm. Like really by far, like 99.99% is coming from the fact that, just processing, sensory information, right? Because, 70% of your brain is fully dedicated to just sight at all times, subconsciously. So it's a very difficult problem. And so you pretty much have to solve that problem to have like any kind of basis to learn any skill quick. And so if you take this kind of like scaling hypothesis naively and apply it to self-driving cars, and I think people are trying to do that, they should train these kind of like end-to-end monolithic AI models that just go directly from the sensor data to a driving decision, it would actually be an incredibly data-heavy process where you have to just scale it like crazy, right? And so, I think what has to happen essentially is you have to tackle that data with a much more data-efficient approach. And so actually what we're doing is something we call factored embodied AI. Yeah.
This is exactly what I was wondering. Like, what's the latest from Helm to deal with that?
Yeah. So basically,
factored autonomy.
Factored embodied AI, more broadly, right, for any area of robotics, not only for self-driving cars, basically rests on the hypothesis that if you first solve geometric reasoning, then your path to solving whatever is the robotics task is going to be much more data efficient, and it's also going to be much more interpretable. And that's critical for safety critical applications, right? So essentially, first we train, large scale foundation models for computer vision, essentially solve the perception problem, right? Where if you give me sensor data, I can convert that to a geometrical representation that is highly robust and salient and very easy to interpret. And, that makes your downstream task a lot easier. So we still use end-to-end learning with that as the input data, but then we get much better data efficiency.
Does that mean like automakers don't have to spend as much on processing power in the vehicles? Or what does that mean for like the automakers and then for me, the selfish consumer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what it means for automakers is that they don't have to wait for their fleets to scale to Tesla size to compete with Tesla. That is the main bottleneck for them, right? Because if you took the pure kind of scaling approach, you would have to wait some number of years before you got enough data, and then you would start your scaling, and then but then by then it's too late. So really it's circumventing that requirement, right? It's basically saying, well, actually we're going to heavily lean on AI-based simulation and this kind of geometric reasoning engine to make it so that with a lot less driving data, we can actually still get very good performance. And so this is something that we showed very recently. For example, we took our, production grade vision stack, and then we employed end-to-end learning on top of that in simulation primarily, and then trained on only 1,000 hours of driving data. And we were able to take that system and then take it to a city in Los Angeles that it's never seen, Torrance, California, and do a vision-only autonomous steering test. So basically, the steering wheel is fully controlled by AI for 20 minutes without any disengagement of the steering wheel. And we were able to handle complex urban driving kind of out of the box.
On 1,000 hours of...
On 1,000 hours of driving data. Yeah.
Can I catch the next ride when you guys get out there? Join you?
Absolutely.
I would love to see that. I guess since we're in this we're in this good company, I do also wonder for founders navigating, the startup moment while they're also dealing with, various levels of their immigration status. Do you have any advice for other founders navigating all that? It was a little different for you coming here as a tween, but any kind of closing thoughts for this crew?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, for any immigration process, it's like never smooth. I think that's for sure. My advice would just be to, find something that you're, really passionate about and, just keep pushing because it is worth it on the other side.
Nice closing thought. Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you.